Operated by foremost spiritualists, this is a project to map and understand the vortex. Only true and verified ascenders will contribute to this account. We are a team of undisclosed psychics, mediums, and empathists who live on the vortex property. We are here to explain how the vortex works and provide a sense of understanding for those who seek knowledge about our vortex. No visitors are allowed to the vortex. We are not at war with the vortex. Rather, we are in ongoing dialogue with the vortex. The renowned spiritualists who reside on the vortex property commune with the vortex and provide safety from mass haunting events. This account aims to provide the history and workings of the vortex in an understandable fashion. This is a public relations effort to create a sense of calm and patience with our vortex and any vortexes that may be in your vicinity. No visitors are allowed to the vortex. Between 1983 and 2000, before the times of peace, there were 3 wars waged on the vortex. This was the time of the ascended Rose Raud's leadership. After being summoned to the vortex, Rose Raud built what is now our organization's headquarters on the vortex property. After initial negotiations with the vortex faltered, Rose Raud waged her first war. We aim to provide the first official documentation of the happenings and reasonings of these wars, including the infamous Third War on the vortex, often called the True War. It is important to note that we have been at peace with the vortex for 24 years. While we will provide coverage of our old wars, the focus of this account will be on this longer-lasting time of peace. The ascended Rose Raud spent her first day living on the vortex property in February of 1983. For the first month, she lived alone, observing and communicating with the vortex. She kept sacred diaries of these days. These were the days she willfully put herself under the spell of the vortex. These were her goofy days. In the presence of spiritual vortexes, many will feel elated, happy, silly, or goofy. This is a deceptive tactic of the vortex. Rose Raud, however, was merely leading the vortex on. After 1 month of her goofy days, she would begin negotiations with the vortex. But first, she would need to ascend the vortex. The goofy days and the dewy grass on the vortex property made it clear that the vortex was in an active state of mass haunting. Rose Raud ceased her goofy days and began collecting every drop of dew on the property in order to infuse it into a defense potion in preparation for the potential dire event of spiritual warfare. In order to begin negotiations with a spiritual vortex, one must first ascend the vortex. In order to ascend a spiritual vortex, one must first pinpoint its core. To locate a vortex core is a delicate and difficult task only achievable by the most powerful of spiritualists. Luckily, Rose Raud was the greatest psychic medium to ever live. In April of 1983, Rose Raud began mapping the vortex. To aid her in this immense task, she was joined by fellow psychic medium Donna Heschley and spiritual healer Turgo Tapid. The results of the mapping project revealed the scope of their enemy, a core measuring no more than 30 yards and rising over a mile into the sky. Once the core was pinpointed, Rose Roud began her work and made multiple attempts to ascend the vortex to begin negotiations. She failed in her first 5 attempts. Donna Heschley and Turgot Tapid were Rose Roud's primary allies in these early days, and they both had very different views. One of Rose Roud's early mentors, Donna Heschley, felt peace must be pursued. The young and fiery Turgot Tapid, however, felt war must be immediately declared on the vortex. The disagreement would lead to the fracturing of Rose Roud and Donna Heschley's relationship, as Rose Roud would eventually side with Turgot Tapid and declare war. After 5 failed attempts, there was growing concern amongst the trio that ascension would not be possible. It was, of course, the 6th effort that worked. A veil was placed around the core and wrapped around Rose Roud. She sat in the center of the core for 5 hours and 21 minutes on May 2nd, 1983, and then she ascended. She was the first person ever recorded achieving ascension of a spiritual vortex. She returned from ascension 36 minutes later. Rose Roud would never divulge details of her ascension, saying it was part of her agreement with the vortex. She would ascend an undisclosed number of times in that month of May. These were the first negotiations with the vortex. The return of Hefferton was a significant occurrence. A year prior, Rose Roud sent her soldier Hefferton on a journey to assemble a team. Turgot Tapid drove Hefferton and his team of 8 assembled psychic warriors from the airport to the vortex property. These were the initial 8. En route, Turgot warned Hefferton Rose Roud was not pleased with his return. She had just achieved her first ascension of the vortex, and she saw Hefferton's returning as a disturbing disruption, and she questioned what he had been up to in his travels. Upon seeing Hefferton and meeting his initial 8, Rose Roud quickly determined that they were not up to task. She sent them into the vortex property to locate the gnome. Hefferton, meanwhile, was angry with Rose Roud for embarrassing him in front of the initial 8. She had called him mean things, and this had hurt his feelings. Hefferton, despite being a skilled empath, was also in fact a drunken, gambling addict. He will not be portrayed positively in this accounting of events. The initial 8 were weak. They all gave up on their task of locating the gnome within a single day. Rose Roud had to punish Hefferton for wasting her time. She sent him into the vortex property to locate the gnome himself. Hefferton was more skilled than the initial 8, and he found the gnome quickly. The infamous story of Hefferton and the gnome is a long story and will be dealt with in a later video series. Please limit questions about this incident and other gnome incidents until it is properly addressed. We understand there is curiosity and anger toward our perceived secrecy regarding our gnomes, but we assure this is only for the purpose of public safety. Hefferton's next task would be to do what he had been originally asked to do: assemble a team. After the failure of the initial 8 came the Wondrous 5. One of the Wondrous 5 was named Garner Garrison. His role in the events of the vortex would be transformative. While the Wondrous 5 laid defensive potion around the property, it would be the Californian psychic from Canada named Garner Garrison who disobeyed Rose Roud's orders and walked into the vortex core. Garner Garrison ascended the vortex. But unlike Rose Roud, he did not return after negotiations. He was held there, suspended in the air. During the time of Garner Garrison being suspended half a mile in the air, 3 of the remaining Wondrous 4 and Hefferton called on Rose Roud to cease negotiations and declare war on the Vortex immediately. Rose Roud, infuriated with both Garner Garrison and the Vortex for mocking her, had Hefferton shoot Garner Garrison to death in the air. His body remained suspended in the air for another week before it splattered to the ground. The date of the splattering was July 5th, 1983. The first war on the Vortex had begun. As the sky turned pink on July 5th, 1983, Rose Roud walked into her meditation chambers and pressed a white button and thus activated her primary apparatus of spiritual warfare, the Karadisc. The Karadisc was developed by Rose Roud and her longtime lover in the early 70s. While other tools are necessary for a Karadisc to operate, for now, we will focus specifically on the Karadisc device. Hefferton and the Wondrous Four positioned the Karadisc to point away from the Vortex core. They applied defensive potion around the property. Meanwhile, Rose Roud sat in her commander base. Her meditation chamber was a place of great power. She soaked in her buke and radiated attack energies. She aimed to assure the Vortex would be sorry it had challenged the ascended Rose Roud.
I have lost the ear of Rose. I had her ear, and now it belongs to Turgo, that slimy wench. I loathe her to my core. A line forms outside Turgo's tent every evening. She heals individually, then she proceeds into the living area for group healing. I tire of Turgo. I resent her healing and feel she is instead performing spells on me. I've spoken this to Rose, but alas, I have lost her ear. This war is not necessary. Turgo, now that she has Rose's ear, she eggs her on. She says, more war. I say less. I say cease. The Vortex does not want war, it wants communication. We are communicators with the spiritual realm. We are not warriors, but Turgo sees herself a warrior. She, the healer. The medic is our grand champion of war. What an irony. I rage so much lately, and I don't know if it's the Vortex or Turgo ensnaring me. I keep these journals so I am not forgotten or misrepresented by those around me. I rage so much. I used to matter around here. I used to matter to her. Now she levitates above us all, above me. She claims to be the greatest psychic medium to ever live. Well, I taught her much. The ascended Rose scares me. She no longer allows us to look into her eyeballs, for she has grown too powerful in these times of war. I miss looking into her eyeballs. I yearn to look into her eyeballs again. There. I said it. I am not a fool. I am Donna Heshley, and I will have the ear of my commander once more. The date is July 19th, 1983. The time is 7:41 at night. Fucking wench.
On August 10th, 1983, the greatest battle of the First War commenced, the 31-hour battle. Rose Roud awoke at dawn and assembled her team in the living area. It was the first time they had seen her since the war began. They were all ordered to avoid eye contact during this meeting. It has been said, but never confirmed, that Rose Roud was over 11 feet tall during this rousing address to her soldiers. She made it clear, the time to attack was now. They would engage in the tactic of shock and awe. She commanded her army to surround the Vortex core. They engaged in direct spiritual warfare for 31 hours. During the battle, the soldiers worked in shifts. All but one, Bishop Garrison, the empath and twin brother of deceased Garner Garrison, did not take a single break. He stood by the Vortex core absorbing and projecting energies for all 31 hours. Prior to this, Bishop Garrison had been considered a joke. He was not taken seriously by any of the other Wondrous Four. They mocked him behind his back for effeminately weeping about his dead twin brother, and Rose Roud commented often that she wished it had been Bishop Garrison who died instead of his brother. Following the 31-hour battle, Rose Roud declared the Vortex greatly weakened, and the shock and awe endeavor a success. She then proclaimed Bishop Garrison to be her new second-in-command, shockingly choosing him over Donna Heshley and Turgot Tappet. Rose Roud shunned all but Bishop Garrison for the remaining month of August. She met privately with Bishop Garrison every day, and she allowed him to look into her eyeballs. As intense resentments over the promotion and special treatment of Bishop Garrison began to grow, the counterattack of the Vortex loomed.
I'm better than them. So much better than them. They mock me. I spend so much time with her now. She lets me in, she lets me see. I know more than them, and they are furious about this. I miss my brother, but I also know his death was fate. I know it led me to her. I believe she's going to give me this vortex. I believe she's going to teach me to ascend. The vortex is weakening. The headaches are less intense. The grass is less dewy. The vortex sees me standing next to the ascended rose, and it is scared. The vortex saw what I did during the battle. It sees me as a warrior, a manly and tough, muscled warrior who rarely cries. Hefferton the fat man and Turgot the twat are plotting against me. They meet every night. I see them and the device they work on. It's called a FESHP or something. They claim it a game changer. I, Bishop Garrison, I am the game changer of this war. The others don't let me sit with them during supper time. The Ascended Rose doesn't allow anyone to witness her eating during wartime. I believe it is because she is shy about the ectoplasmic goo she leaks from her eyes. But I would never judge her. So I eat alone. All alone. I eat my gravy and beans alone, and no one else can have them. They eat their special foods. I hope they choke on them. But I also do not care. Because they are beneath me. They are beneath myself and my eternal commander and my new best friend, the Ascended Rose. The date is August 29th, 1983. The time is 3:36 in the morning.
That morning, everyone woke to a mood of exuberance. The spiritualists, who had been angry with one another and engaged in conflict, decided to frolic giddily together on the fields. They did funny walks and made silly voices to one another. There was joy in the air, and there was no dew in the grass. No one had a headache. The war was clearly over, said Bishop Garrison. Rose Roud agreed. Thus, the first war was declared mission accomplished. Victory would be celebrated. If Rose Roud had not been weakened by her valiant war efforts, she would see the obvious, that the Vortex was playing a trick on her. The Vortex would engage in a months-long period of deceptive peace. Similar to the Goofy Days, this would be a period of pure joy. Unlike the Goofy Days, however, the deceptive peace was not a trick being played by Rose Roud. She had actually been fooled by the Vortex. Turgot Tappet warned Rose Roud immediately. She was being misled by her enemy and her new so-called ally, Bishop Garrison. One night, the spiritualists got naked and danced by the fire. They showed each other their silly walks and funny voices. The Vortex watched their derangement from the distance, gaining strength and preparing for the Second War. On December 16th, it would strike them with a ferocious and shocking blow. It was everywhere. It bubbled from the grass. It dripped from trees. On the morning of December 16th, 1983, the deceptive peace came to a startling close, and the Second War began. Ectoplasmic goo was the artillery of choice for this grand attack by the Vortex. The spiritualists spent the following week cleaning and collecting the ectoplasmic goo which made them all gravely ill. A great dispute occurred over what to do with the goo. Some wanted it to be burned. Some wanted it to be dumped in the lake. It was Turgot Tapid, however, that demanded the goo be preserved in a special buplin. Roseroud, feeling that preserving the goo would be too dangerous, decided to burn the goo during a ritual. Some have suggested that this burning of the goo was a false flag event, and that the real ectoplasmic goo was preserved in a secret buplin deep in the woods. These rumors have never been verified and are considered conspiratorial. The Second War lasted a mere 19 days. All of Roseroud's spiritualists lay incapacitated by the vortex. Bishop Garrison spent the entire Second War hiding like a coward, weeping inside of a bathroom tub on the property. It was Roseroud, alone, who defeated the vortex and won the Second War. Some of the only records from this period of 19 days are from Roseroud's personal journals. These journals would not be understandable by a non-ascended person and will not be shared. In summary, they made one thing clear. Roseroud alone stunningly defeated the vortex, weakening it to a point that it no longer swirled and could no longer inflict its spells. She defeated the vortex herself alone, with the help of absolutely no one else. The ascended Roseroud won the Second War on the vortex. On January 3rd, 1984, Roseroud pushed the button to deactivate the Caradisc. Thus began the Ascended Era. 13 years where the spiritualists maintained what they assumed to be complete control over the vortex. Roseroud, tremendously weakened from her fight with the vortex, began what is referred to as the Great Ignoring. She was so disgusted and disappointed by her pathetic army that she refused to speak to them for the remainder of the decade. Her only contact with her soldiers was to frequently appear in their dreams, where she would sternly stare at them from a far distance. The Ascended Era lasted 13 years. It was not a time of peace. Rather, it was a time of dominance. The Great Ignoring persisted. Only Turgot Tapid was permitted speaking time with Roseroud. They met once a week so Roseroud could berate her. Roseroud was said to be so weakened from defeating the vortex that she was translucent and the size of an infant. She refused to be looked at and spoke from the other side of a veil. While the Great Ignoring was a horrid calamity, the spiritualist would nonetheless find much joy and enrichment in the early days of the Ascended Era. The vortex energies had dispersed, no longer empowered in a swirling core. Thus, the wondrous Four and Hefferton finally were able to wield their powers. They controlled the vortex. They owned the vortex. They were above the vortex. On the first day of the Ascended Era, Roseroud would be summoned by a television. On it, she saw a child. Roseroud would become obsessed with this child. This child would change everything, every single thing, and Roseroud knew it as she looked upon the child upon the television. The child's name was Yera Peoples.
I fear that perhaps my time is nearing its conclusion. I am sick. Turgot's potions are no longer working. I worry she isn't even trying to heal me. If I die, let it be known I was a proud woman. The woman who taught the Ascended Rose how to wield her powers and body. But now she doesn't speak to me. She doesn't look at me. No one does except for Turgot the twat, who angrily feeds me my potion every day, throwing at me like a rabid bitch. But at least there is my sweet, soft Harriet. Harriet, sweet, wonderful, silky, gorgeous Harriet. She is ignorant and loyal to the Ascended Rose, but she still is kind enough to spend time with me. If she is kind enough to laugh with me, to nuzzle my forehead and ease me, to give my love a place to flow inside of, although she has been quite resentful since I moved her hand toward my under region. I was not doing it as a mode of perversion. I was merely showing her the depleted state of my sacral chakra. Oh God, oh dear shit. I hope she returns to the room. I hope she gives me a hug. I worry they've changed the key. I haven't had potion in a while. This is Donna Heshley. The date is May 11th, 1985. Oh dear, I don't want to die.
At Donna Heshley's funeral, Rose Roud spoke of her mentor and friend with disappointment and disgust. After delivering her speech, she continued ignoring everyone. She did not let it be known, but she was morbidly depressed by the death of her mentor, and she carried regret over the mean things she had said to her on her deathbed. With Donna Heshley's death, what was once the Wondrous Five, and then the Wondrous Four, was now the Wondrous Three. That night, Rose Roud watched with rage as Hefferton buried Donna Heshley. The date was June 22nd, 1985. Rose Roud had defeated the Vortex. Her army stood strong, and the ascended Rose Roud's Vortex was slowly becoming a place of prominent power. But even still, she was miserable and isolated. She soaked in her buke and thought of her dead friend. She tried to connect with her that night, but she couldn't. Donna Heshley would not answer back. Rose Roud, the greatest psychic medium to ever live, would try to connect with Donna Heshley every single night until her own death. Donna Heshley never answered back. Harriet Johanna was the third, thus far unmentioned member of the now Wondrous Three. She was a jack of many trades, an empath, a psychic, a partial healer, and a tarot master. She acted as primary aid to the ascended Rose Roud. During the Great Ignoring, Rose Roud would deliver orders telepathically. Harriet Johanna's primary task was to acquire the child, while Turgot, Bishop Garrison, and Hefferton took great joy in the ascended era. Harriet Johanna was terribly affected by the Great Ignoring. She had taken significant joy in making Rose Roud her breakfast, in cleaning the ascended Rose Roud's robes and face after dinner. But now her days were spent hopelessly pursuing a child celebrity. Meanwhile, a love affair began to swirl. Turgot, Tapid, and Hefferton had grown close during their long development process of a new prototype device, the FESHP. Turgot would often ask Hefferton, why was he not wondrous? Why did he allow Rose Roud to emasculate him? One night, Hefferton watched Harriet Johanna, sobbing, smoking a cigarette by the buplin. It was then that an idea struck him. He would be the one to acquire the child. He would end the Great Ignoring, and he would be proclaimed wondrous once and for all. Being a highly disciplined empath, Bishop Garrison was able to tune into the emotions of others. This, he claimed, is why he spent the entire Second War weeping in the bathtub. Everyone absolutely loathed Bishop Garrison. His only friend was his pen pal, the Hungarian prince. Bishop Garrison wrote to him every day. He was very, very proud that he had a friendship with such an esteemed man. On Christmas of 1987, Bishop Garrison would do something unthinkable. He invited the Hungarian prince to the VORTEX property for supper. As has been clarified many times, there were and are still no visitors allowed to the vortex, not even royalty. This was a clear violation of Rose Route's rule. Bishop Garrison spent the next week engaged in some sort of bizarre slumber party with the Hungarian prince. The other spiritualists reacted in absolute horror as they faced something they hadn't faced in years: company. Rose Route remained in her room every time the Hungarian prince would visit, in righteous rebuke of her soldiers' mortifying insubordination. He would be taught a painful lesson, because the authority of the ascended Rose Route would not and could not be challenged. And, as has been made very clear, there were and are no visitors allowed to the vortex. The FESP was a work in progress for years. It wasn't until the summer of 1988 that a working version was placed atop the hill. Rose Route herself attended the unveiling ceremony, although she stood away from everyone and refused to look at them. The FESP was a device for assessing vortex intensity. According to the FESP, however, the vortex was beginning to swirl again with ferocity. At the ceremony, for a brief moment, the great ignoring was lifted as the ascended Rose Route walked up to Hefferton and slapped him. In front of everyone, in front of his lover Turgo, in front of the vortex itself, she slapped him on the face. She slapped him on the rear. She slapped him and slapped him and slapped him. "How dare you?" she screamed. "I have defeated the vortex. It sits there bowing to me. It does not swirl, and it will never swirl again." She slapped him once more, and she left Hefferton bleeding on the ground. It was a terrible unveiling ceremony. The morning after the slapping, Hefferton left on an airplane to travel to California. He had a plan. He would get very drunk on a series of connecting flights until he was kicked off. From there, he would stay at a series of hotels where he would order food and vomit inside nice bathrooms. Hefferton was very excited about this. He needed some time off after the slapping, and he wanted to avoid seeing his lover Turgo after being repeatedly slapped in front of her. While Hefferton flew over the desert, drunk, sad, and happy, something truly wondrous would happen. Seated next to him on the airplane was a mother and her daughter. Hefferton began talking to the mother and learned she was also a spiritualist. He drunkenly confided all of his shames and humiliations to this mother and child. When he got off the plane, the mother invited Hefferton to join them at an event. Completely intoxicated, Hefferton showed up to the taping of a television show hosted by a child psychic. The lights dimmed, and the announcer shouted, "Please welcome the little girl who can talk to the dead." Hefferton smiled proudly to himself as some puke fell out of his mouth. His plan had worked. He was in. It was a Tuesday morning, January 1989. A delivery truck approached the VORTEX property and dropped off a box addressed to Rose Route. Inside was a crystal ball and a hastily written note. It read, "Be back soon. The great ignoring nears its end." The note smelled of tacky booze and casino carpet.
My rose, I'm a producer now. Be back soon. A big producer now, you see. But the show is coming to an end. Be back canceled. The show is coming to an end. They found the boy she said was dead. They found the boy she said was dead. He was alive. She had told the parents to stop looking for him. They found the boy she said was dead. Alive! Oh my God! In a ditch. Alive without a hitch. Oops! She had assured the parents that he was dead. But he was alive! Oops! Assured them he was definitely dead. She told those parents to go ahead and stop looking for his son. My rose, be back soon, my rose. Be back soon, my rose. Be back soon, my rose.
The one, the only, please welcome the little girl who can talk to the dead, Year of Peoples.
But the show is coming to an end. It got canceled. The show is coming to an end. They found the boy she said was dead. They found the boy she said was dead. Was alive. She had told the parents to stop looking for him. Found the boy she said was dead. Alive. Oh my God. In a ditch. Alive without a hitch. Oops. She had assured the parents that he was dead, but he was alive. Oops. Assured them he was definitely dead. She told those parents to go ahead and stop looking for their son. Be back soon, my rose. Be back soon, my rose. Be back soon, my rose.
The sky noise started on a brisk March morning. Turgot Tappet's journal described it as a filthy screech. Harriet Johanna said it sounded like a gurgling echo. It came from the sky, above the vortex core. Unusual smells, visuals, and sounds are not unheard of in the proximity of a spiritual vortex. But the suddenness of the sky noise panicked all the spiritualists. If they were truly in the ascended era, why would the sky be making such odd noises? Was the Feshp correct? Was the vortex beginning to swirl again? Rose Roud stayed in her meditation chamber that whole day. When she came down for supper, the spiritualists asked her to please cease the great ignoring and tell them what the sky noise was. Rose Roud ignored them. In truth, she herself was the most upset by the sky noise because she knew exactly what this particular sky noise was. This was a summoning. As the vortex did to her years ago, the vortex was singing out. Throughout the realms, the vortex was calling upon an ascender. Sprockets are root-like structures below ground of an active spiritual vortex. They can be broken and peeled to squeeze sprocket juice from, or ground for sprocket powder. Sprockets must be contained. If sprockets are not contained, they become gnomes. Hefferton had dumped the original gnome in the lake, and the vortex had, of course, been defeated by the ascended Rose Roud in the Second War. But one day in the summer of 1989, the Hungarian prince and Bishop Garrison were out frolicking in the fields when they both tripped over a large sprocket. Bishop Garrison knew this confirmed the vortex was swirling again. He knew this likely meant there was a gnome residing on the property. But Bishop Garrison was having fun in the Ascended Era. He did not want the Ascended Era to end, so he buried the Sprugget. He found more Spruggets in the following days and weeks, and he buried each one of them as the sky noise continued to bellow from above. It wouldn't be until August that Tergo Tapid caught Bishop Garrison burying a Sprugget in the dead of night. She approached him, interrogated him, and made him confess. She then blackmailed him with the information. Bishop Garrison became the spiritual and sexual servant to Tergo Tapid. He spent all of his time serving her. Tergo Tapid, meanwhile, also kept the Spruggets a secret and began burying them herself in the same hole. Because if the Ascended Roseroud found out about the Spruggets, then she would make them all search the property and find the gnome. This was not a task anyone felt like doing, because everyone was busy having so much goddamn fun in the Ascended Era. The helicopter flew over the lake, and it made Hefferton sick. They were getting close. It had been 2 years since Hefferton was on the Vortex property. He sat across from Yira Peoples, now 17 years old, and her mother. In the 2 years, Hefferton had become a producer of Yira's successful television program. She had been the little girl who could talk to the dead until a recent controversy resulted in her show's cancellation and an immediate need for funds. Hefferton had made multiple sexual advances toward the mother until she relented. They were now a disgusting husband and wife. He, Hefferton, now somehow the surrogate father to this infamous child. He looked at his family sitting across from him in the helicopter, both mother and daughter pouting grumpily. In that moment, he had a fantasy, a striking vision. He opened the helicopter window, stuck his head out, and put it into the spinning blades. He felt the rotors clog on his neck back for a split second as he decapitated himself in front of his fake family and plopped into the lake. From there, he watched the helicopter spin out of control and crash directly into the Ascended Roseroud, blowing her into 1,000,000 pieces. But alas, he remained in the helicopter. He looked out and saw the Vortex property come into view. Hefferton had returned. And just as he had planned, within an hour, the Great Ignoring would end, and a new spiritualist would be declared wondrous. Much to his surprise, however, it would not be him. A helicopter landed on the Vortex property. Hefferton got off first. He had gained weight. He approached Tergo Tapid, who spit on his crotch in disgust. He moved on to a chained-up Bishop Garrison, who solemnly nodded at him. Then he approached her. The Ascended Roseroud had not seen Hefferton since the slapping occurred years prior. Roseroud ignored Hefferton as he approached and whispered something gently in her ear. After he whispered this, Roseroud turned to Hefferton. She embraced him and gave him a kiss on the forehead. She walked to the helicopter, knelt to her knees, and stretched out her arms. Yira Peoples had arrived, and out she stepped off the helicopter, as striking and magical as Roseroud had imagined her. Roseroud stepped forward, tears of happiness gleaming in her eyes. And then, an older woman, the mother of Yira Peoples and bride of Hefferton, stepped off the helicopter. Roseroud's face dropped. She turned to Hefferton. "Who the fuck is that?" Bishop Garrison walked with a spring in his step. He was delighted. He was on his way to the first party thrown by Roseroud since the end of the Great Ignoring. Bishop Garrison was eager to talk to Rose Roud once more, to look in her eyeballs, to eat her delicious cake. He hoped the Hungarian prince would be there. He hoped Turgot Tapid would be nice to him tonight. As he approached, he saw Pammy Peoples, the mother of Yera Peoples and bride of Hefferton, dancing by the lake. She waved to him. He waved back. "Are you going to the party, Pammy?" Bishop giggled gleefully. He then watched as she repeatedly slammed her own head against a rock until she lay motionless, covered in blood, making a disgusting gurgling noise. Bishop Garrison stood frozen in shock, watching the gurgling woman for a full 10 minutes before he sprinted to inform the others of what he saw. He entered the party and screamed, "The child's mother is dead! She bashed her head into a rock by the lake." "My mother is dead!" shouted Yera Peoples, horrified. "Yes, yes! She is gurgling blood by the lake! It's awful!" As everyone panicked, Bishop Garrison walked up to Hefferton. "I'm sorry for your loss." "What loss?" "Didn't you hear?" said Bishop Garrison. "Your wife is dead. She broke her head by the lake." Hefferton stared off. "Shame. She would have loved this cake." After Patty Peoples died, a mood of suspicion and morbidity entrenched the property. Yera Peoples was given a potion to offset her violent state of grief. She stayed under the watch of Turgot Tapid, who comforted her and provided her warmth. Hefferton, meanwhile, was nowhere to be seen. After 5 days, Bishop Garrison led a solo search party to find him. Bishop Garrison came upon a hump in the grass. Inside the hump, he heard the voice of Hefferton. He took out a knife and stabbed the hump. Juices poured out of it. The hump began to subside. He heard the sound of Hefferton screaming in agony. Bishop Garrison, yet again, sprinted back to the residence in a panic. He banged on the door of Rose Roud. She answered her door and saw Bishop crying. She smacked him. "Why do you always run through doors with your tears like some sort of little fairy boy? What sort of soldier are you?" Rose Roud asked. Bishop Garrison composed himself and whimpered, "Ascended Rose, I have awful news. There are gnomes on the property. I found Hefferton inside of one." It is said that at this moment, the rage of Rose Roud was so potent that Bishop Garrison urinated himself in front of her. When he did this, Rose Roud became even angrier and brutally beat him. She spent the next hour beating up Bishop Garrison for delivering such awful news to her. They would soon discover there was not one gnome, not 2 gnomes, not 3 nor 4. No, there were 5 gnomes residing on the Vortex property. 5 gnomes. The reckoning of the 5 gnomes had begun. The spiritualists sat one evening, eating a delicious spaghetti meatball dinner. Hefferton entered the dining room. He was covered in a thick, gooey substance. They hadn't seen him in months. Hefferton smiled bashfully. "May I please have some spaghetti meatball?" he asked. In the months of Hefferton's absence, much had changed. Yera Peoples had taken over as second in command to the ascended Rose Roud. She spent all of her time under the tutelage of her new commander. She was rarely allowed out onto the Vortex property, as Turgot Tapid led the dangerous gnome mapping project. Harriet Johanna, Bishop Garrison, and the Hungarian prince searched the property for hours each day, attempting to locate Hefferton and the 5 gnomes. Every day, Turgot Tapid returned to have supper and be berated by Rose Roud for not finding a single gnome or Hefferton. It was a time of tension. It was a time of jealous simmering. So there Hefferton stood, covered in goo, drunk, on a balmy pink evening, August 10th, 1990. Rose Roud slurped her spaghetti meatball. She stood up and said, "Dear Hefferton, welcome back. We missed you, but your time is now concluded." Hefferton sprinted out the door. Yira peoples sent spiritual energies toward Hefferton as he ran away. He fell flat on his face. This is how Hefferton broke his face. Rose Roud looked at her pupil and smiled. "The acquired child, you are my favorite person to ever live," Rose Roud cooed proudly. The deathbed of Hefferton was a very nice deathbed. He kept the sheets clean and pleasant smelling. He had placed candy by the bedside in case a friend ever visited. None ever did. It was September 6th, 1993. Hefferton's gnome infection had put him out of commission. He was frail. Hefferton was kept in a broken bublin to avoid the spread of his gnome infection. A tiny man in pointy shoes visited him once a week and gave him a medicine. The medicine made Hefferton's face stop hurting. It made his feet go numb. Hefferton grabbed the tiny man in the pointy shoes and pulled him into his deathbed. "Please," he said, "take me outside. Take me to the vortex core. I need to ascend." The tiny man in the pointy shoes had been warned about this. He gently touched Hefferton's hand. "I am not allowed to bring you to the vortex core, Mr. Hefferton," said the tiny man. And then he left. It had been a year since Hefferton saw any of the other spiritualists. He was isolated in a bunker of doom, left to bleed out by his own commander and surrogate daughter. It was September 13th, 1993. The tiny man in the pointy shoes entered the deathbed to give his medicines. But when he went under the covers, Hefferton wasn't there. Hefferton would be found dead, wrapped in the curtains of the vortex core. He did not ascend because he was not an ascender. He was not wondrous. He was not worthwhile. This is the end of Hefferton's story, and he will not be mentioned ever again. Please never ask about him or say his name from now on. Thank you. For the first time ever, the spiritualists on the Vortex property engaged in a recruitment process. They were seeking a new empath. Rose Roud demanded this new empath be the best empath, the most skilled empath, a wondrous empath. When the spiritualist world hears that the ascended Rose Roud is hiring, one would assume applicants would come in droves. No, for a full year, not one single empath applied for the position. All were clearly too cowardly and pathetic. Without an empath, who on earth would read the FESP? December 20th, 1994. A white Buick approached the Vortex property. It parked. It went through the long entry process before it approached Oliver, the new Vortex security man. "What are you doing here? There are no visitors allowed to the Vortex," said Oliver. The man inside cranked his window down. "I'm here for a job," he said calmly. The man's name was Nettie Hoyt, the strongest empath to ever live. This is the beginning of Nettie Hoyt's story. Nettie Hoyt's interview with Rose Roud went well. It lasted 13 hours. Nettie Hoyt brought a new energy to the Vortex property. It was almost as if the resentments and spites of the past dissolved upon his arrival. Everyone loved Nettie. Everyone except Yira Peoples. She found the new empath smug. She hated his face. Sometimes she fantasized about cutting his face with a pair of scissors. But Rose Roud felt much differently. The journals of Rose Roud reveal she had fallen in love with Nettie Hoyt. She wrote pages of extremely well-told, spiritually erotic fiction about him, and enjoyed watching him get wet and naked in the bath. She was not subtle in her pursuit, and began engaging in inappropriate touching and rubbing during meetings with Nettie. "Ascended Rose, please don't touch me like that," said Nettie. This was the first time Rose Roud had ever been sexually rejected. She was mortified. Over the following weeks, Rose Roud gazed on at Nettie with angry lust, while Yira Peoples eyed him with repulsion, until March 15th, 1995. Yira Peoples was assigned to partner with Nettie Hoyt for potion dispersal that morning. They rode the property together, Yira Peoples trying to avoid looking at Nettie's dumb, terrible face. They stopped to insert potion into the first buplin. When Nettie returned to the four-wheeler, he put the potion bag into the back and climbed next to Yira Peoples. They rode on to the next buplin in silence until Nettie spoke. "You dislike me?" Yira turned to him. "Yes, I do." "Why?" "I do not like empaths. You feel?" "You are good at feeling." "What good does that do us?" said Yira Peoples. "Also, I do not like your dumb, ugly face." Nettie nodded. "Many enjoy my face," said Nettie. "I do not. Our last empath was a nothing man, a loser. He destroyed my mother." Nettie nodded more. "You are angry." Yira Peoples parked the four-wheeler. She slashed Nettie in the face with her nails. Blood splattered. Nettie nodded. "Please do that again." She did it again. "Once more." She slashed his face once more. The two began to passionately kiss in the four-wheeler. Unfortunately, at this moment, Rose Roud looked out from her meditation room to see her pupil and her new obsession making out in a four-wheeler in the distance. This would create conflict. Friday morning, August 11th, 1995. Bishop Garrison parked outside Pop Mart. He was under direct orders from the ascended Rose Roud to find and procure the collar bell. He went into Pop Mart, said hello to store owner Bob Pop,
"Hello, Bob Pop."
and walked immediately to the bell aisle. He grabbed the first bell he saw and brought it to the checkout lane. It was a bright blue, tiny bell. "Good morning," said Bob Pop as he scanned the bell. "Oh, hello, nice morning. What is your bell return policy?" asked Bishop Garrison. "Bells must be returned within the week for a full refund. Please check your bell before leaving to make sure you are satisfied," smiled Bob Pop. Bishop Garrison purchased the bell, walked outside Pop Mart, and went to the payphone across the street. He dialed. A click on the other end. "Ring it!" snapped the voice of Rose Roud. "Ring it to me!" Bishop Garrison held the bell to the phone. He rang it. Silence. "No, that is not the bell." Click. She hung up. Bishop Garrison walked back across the street, went back into Pop Mart, walked back up to Bob Pop at the checkout counter. "Hello, I need to return this bell. Is it broken?" asked Bob Pop. "No, just not the bell for me," said Bishop Garrison, cracking his chapped lips with a pleasant smirk. 14 hours later, Bob Pop watched as the strange man across the street rang a bell into the payphone. The sun was setting. The man walked back to the store, returned the bell, and brought another to the checkout lane. "This is the last bell," Bob Pop said. "You have purchased and returned all my other bells." "Well, Let's hope this is the one. Bishop smiled. Bishop Garrison plopped across the street. Yet again, he dialed the payphone, rang the bell into it, and waited. He hung up. He walked back across the street, entered the store. "Sir, you have purchased and returned every single bell," said Bob Pop. Bishop Garrison politely smiled. Yes, it turns out it was actually the first bell. Bishop then purchased the bright blue tiny bell and left. 1 week later, Turgot Tapid watched as Bishop Garrison operated a strange panel device in the dining room. "What are you doing?" Bishop Garrison withheld the truth. But Turgot Tapid was a strong interrogator and potion crafter, so she quickly broke him. Turgot Tapid confronted Rose Roud that night. "Ascended Rose, why have you been making the queer man do such odd things with that bell?" asked Turgot. Rose Roud soaked in her buke, dazed. "My sweet Donna," she sang, "your beauty oozes." Turgot Tapid left the room. Donna Heshley had been dead for over 10 years. Rose Roud had never, not once, gotten someone's name wrong. And why was she making the queer man do such odd things with that bell? Turgot came to a sudden realization. Rose Roud had lost her mind. Her reign was complete. It was time. Time for Turgot Tapid to finally take control of the Vortex. Nettie Hoyt called a meeting. "Ascended Rose, I have completed my mapping project and have located each gnome. I regret to inform you that the gnomes were being incorrectly mapped by Turgot Tapid and her team." Turgot Tapid scoffed and lit a cigarette. Nettie continued. "Also, the vortex core has moved at least 5 feet, and it has grown in size." Turgot lost her temper. She whipped her cigarette at Nettie's face. It bounced off him. Yura Peoples picked the lit cigarette up and threw it back at Turgot Tapid. "How dare you throw a cigarette at me, you motherless cunt," Turgot Tapid hissed. But what Nettie Hoyt said next would silence the room. "Ascended Rose, your vortex is swirling again? It is larger and more powerful than it has ever been. The grass is soaked with dew. Didn't you notice?" Everyone froze. Every single spiritualist except Rose Roud was aware of this. But the last time Rose Roud was informed that the vortex was still swirling was the slapping, when she brutally slapped a former employee for suggesting so. Rose Roud perceived her defeat of the vortex in the Second War as her defining accomplishment and the true testament to her title as the greatest psychic medium to ever live. To suggest the vortex was not under her command was a great affront to her legacy. Everyone waited in the silence for Rose Roud to scream, to stand up and slap Nettie, perhaps slap him to death. But instead, she nodded slowly. "Then I must go back up," she declared. Rose Roud was then wrapped in ascension fabric. She sat in the vortex core, waiting to ascend. The spiritualists waited. "How long does it usually take?" asked Nettie. The only recorded ascension was May 2nd, 1983. Harriet Johanna squeaked, nervously pacing in the corner. "It took 5 hours and 21 minutes. She returned 36 minutes later." "She will not ascend," said Turgot, puffing smoke into Harriet Johanna's face. "Why would you say such a thing about the Ascended Rose?" asked Harriet. "The Ascended Rose Roud was the greatest psychic medium to ever live. The woman out there is not the Ascended Rose Roud. It is a confused old bat who watches trash television all the time." Harriet Johanna gasped. Turgot Tapid blew more smoke into Harriet Johanna's face. "When she returns in an hour, in a confused daze, forgetting why she was out there, I will go to the vortex core. I will ascend. I will not negotiate with the vortex. I will declare war." Turgot took Harriet Johanna's palm. She put her cigarette out in it. "You will be my number 2. Harriet Johanna was exceptionally loyal to Rose Roud, but she was also a weak coward. Also, Turgot Tappet had just hurt her hand very badly with that cigarette, so Harriet Johanna decided to just go along with Turgot's plan for the time being. November 3rd, 1996. 2 in the morning. Turgot Tappet sat in the vortex core, wrapped in ascension fabric for the 37th time since March. Despite her many attempts, she could not ascend. Neither could Rose Roud, who had only made 2 attempts herself. Harriet Johanna kept watch from the attic. If anyone were to find out that Turgot Tappet was attempting to ascend, they would know a coup was underway. The attic door opened. Bishop Garrison entered. "Harriet, what are you doing in the attic?" Harriet Johanna panicked. "I have betrayed the ascended Rose. I deserve to die," she shouted, hitting herself in the face. Bishop Garrison then realized that Harriet Johanna was in the attic for the same reason as him, to keep watch for Turgot Tappet. He closed the door and left, without saying another word. Turgot Tappet felt that her command over Bishop Garrison and Harriet Johanna would be strategically vital in her attempt to take control of the vortex. Little did she know, an opposing alliance was flourishing. Yira Peoples and Nettie Hoyt, dissatisfied with the other spiritualists, began forming a new plan. November 11th, 1996. Nettie and Yira took a strapped oak chair to their pinpointed spot. They poked the pointy legs of the chair into the moist earth. Nettie strapped himself into the chair while Yira planted 10 rod devices into the ground. Nettie put his fingers into the rods. Yira kissed him tenderly before placing a metallic mask over his face. This was the reader chair, created by Nettie Hoyt when he was merely 9 years old. When operated by a skilled empath, a reader chair allowed one to communicate with the realm between dirt and soul, the gooey place deep within, the place that makes us gurgle. To put it simply, Nettie would use the reader chair to introduce himself to each of the 5 gnomes. He would then begin negotiations with the gnomes. Every day became similar. Turgot would sneak off and try to ascend in the early mornings, with the watchful aid of her dubious duo. Nettie and Yira would set up the reader chair, and Nettie would communicate with the gnomes. And Rose Roud, oblivious to it all, would watch her television, occasionally remembering to perform vortex-related tasks. April 11th, 1997. It was Nettie's 9th meeting with Carl, the 3rd gnome. When interacting with a gnome, one must be cautious. Gnomes can be extremely charismatic and fun to be around. They are very silly and good at tickling. Nettie Hoyt was skilled enough to handle it, though. He never acted silly with the gnomes. He never let them see him smile or tickle his sensitive places. When the gnomes acted silly, Nettie would sternly say, "No, we cannot be so silly right now. We must negotiate." And the gnomes respected Nettie Hoyt. So they listened. While Nettie operated the reader chair, Yira Peoples kept him moisturized and fed. Nettie had given strict instructions. "If you see me acting silly, unplug the reader chair." Negotiations were going well, and a deal was nearing. This deal would call for the spiritualists to allow the 5 gnomes to live on the Vortex property with the conditional promise of no gnome attacks and limited proliferation. Constant contact would need to be maintained between the gnomes and Nettie Hoyt for the deal to be upheld. A high antagonistic gnome population makes ascension nearly impossible. Nettie knew this and felt negotiations were the only way to proceed. If the gnomes were on their side, he felt they would aid in ascension. Turgo Tapid also knew this. She disagreed with negotiation. She felt all the gnomes should be slaughtered instead, so she could ascend. May 3rd, 1997. Bishop Garrison walked the property, thinking of his dead twin brother, his dead mother, his dead father, when he noticed something in the distance. Across the lake, a strange vibration caught his eye, something twitching. He made his way to the other side, falling several times in the dirt. He reached it. He yelped in an effeminate manner. It was a gnome, the first gnome Bishop Garrison had ever seen. Curious, he grabbed a rock and threw it at the gnome. The gnome spasmed and spit goo. It made a strange screeching noise. Bishop Garrison threw another rock at the gnome. He threw another. 1 hour later, Bishop Garrison picked up the final chunk of dismembered gnome and tossed it in the lake. He ran to Turgo Tapid, giddy with joy. "I have done it. I have killed a gnome," said Bishop Garrison, walking into Turgo's room, covered in dead gnome goo. Turgo Tapid would celebrate by having Bishop Garrison pleasure her. She had only 4 gnomes left to slaughter. The next day, Nettie sat in the reader chair, waiting to meet with Tom, the second gnome. Tom would keep Nettie waiting for hours. This was unlike him. It would take days for Nettie to learn what Bishop Garrison had done under the orders of Turgo Tapid. Once he learned that a gnome had been murdered, he knew that his work was all for nothing. The great gnome negotiations were over. The gnomes were angry. The vortex was swirling, and it seemed Turgo Tapid would get her wish once and for all. Complete, total, true war.